Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. On this program, I want to talk about the two witnesses, Enoc and Elijah, who God will send back to earth following the destruction of America, England, and Russia in World War III, and the takeover of the Roman Catholic Church by the New World Order. Let's see where St. John describes these two prophets in the book of Revelation. In chapter 11, St. John writes, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days. And in verse number 7, "And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and overcome them, and kill them." Notice that it is the beast from the bottomless pit, that is the one world government, that will kill the two prophets, not the Antichrist, as is so commonly misunderstood. Now let's look at an earlier passage in Revelation that describes Elijah's role in the end times. In chapter 7, St. John writes, "And I saw another angel coming up from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God." Now how do we know that St. John is describing Elijah here? As you know, in Bible prophecy, Jerusalem is the center of the universe. So the rising of the sun would refer to an area east of Jerusalem. Now Elijah was called the Tishbite because he was from Thesbas, a town in the Gilead mountains which is east of Jerusalem. Therefore St. John is using this sun imagery to describe the prophet Elijah. Elijah's primary mission will be to convert the Jews. And now let's look where St. John describes the prophet Enoc. In chapter 10, St. John writes, "And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head, and his face as the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire." Now once again, St. John is using sun imagery to describe the prophet Enoc. From Bible history, we know that Enoc was translated into heaven when he was 365 years of age. When this prophet's face is as the sun, St. John is referring to a solar year, which, as you know, has 365 days. So that is the connection. Enoc lived 365 years, and a solar calendar consists of 365 days. Once again, St. John uses sun imagery to reveal who this prophet is. And in verse 2, we find what Enoc's mission is. "And he had in his hand a little open book, and he set his right foot on the sea, and his left foot on the land." The reason Enoc has one foot on the sea and one foot on the land is because his mission is to the Gentiles. That means he will preach to island nations and landlocked nations. In other words, to the entire rest of the world. And St. John continues in verse number 5. "And the angel which I saw standing on the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever, that time shall be no longer." Now here we find Enoc's second mission, and that is to give the timing of the end. And now let's look at where the two witnesses, Enoc and Elijah, are found in the book of Daniel. In chapter 12, Daniel writes, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this side of the bank of the river, and the other on that side of the bank of the river." Now the one on this side of the bank of the river would be the prophet Elijah, because he is preaching in Jerusalem, in other words, on the near bank. The prophet on the far bank of the river would be the prophet Enoc, because he is preaching to the far-off Gentile nations. And now Daniel asks a question of Enoc. "And I said to the man clothed with linen, who was upon the waters of the river, How long shall it be to the end of these wonders?" Notice here the prophet is now standing on the waters, whereas in the previous verse he was standing on the bank. In other words, just as in Revelation, the prophet Enoc has one foot on the land and one foot on the sea, again indicating that his mission is to many peoples and many nations. And notice that it is Enoch that Daniel asks a question about the timing of the end. Remember back in Revelation, the mighty angel is clothed with a cloud, with a rainbow on his head, and his face like the sun. Notice the time sequence there. First the rain cloud, then the rainbow, and then the sun. And we continue with Daniel. And he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him that lives forever. Now here the prophet holds up both hands, whereas back in Revelation he held up only one hand. Because in Revelation he was holding a little book in the other hand. And when he swears by him who lives forever, this is almost the exact same phraseology as in Revelation. And Enoch says that it will be a time, times, and half a time. And when the scattering of the holy people will be accomplished, all these things shall be finished. Now the time, times, and half a time refers to the Antichrist, which is the second half of the tribulation period. Again, one of Enoch's missions will be to preach about the timing of the end. In conclusion, by studying the clues that St. John leaves us, we can determine that the two witnesses are the prophets Enoch and Elijah, not Elijah and Moses as some claim. And if you would like more information, simply write to the address you see on your screen.